I never imagined the people I loved most, the ones who ate at my table, laughed at my jokes, and tucked me into bed when storms rolled through, could be the architects of my undoing. If you're new here, subscribe. I post real messy stories every day. My name is Serena. I'm 24, and for most of my life I thought family was the one anchor I could always rely on. My father owned a mid-sized construction firm that had grown from one pickup truck and a clipboard into a modest empire of contracts and developments. My mother ran the household with quiet precision. Marcus and Elena, my older cousins, moved in with us after their parents died, and eventually they were more like siblings than cousins. We were a family stitched together by grief and stubborn love, or so I believed. When my father died, unexpectedly, during a late-night call with a contractor, the world shifted under my feet. The sickness looked sudden to everyone else, but to me it felt like the last of the safety nets had been cut. The funeral was an exaggerated ceremony of sorrow that smelled of lilies and faint pity. People smiled in measured ways. They said the right things, and afterwards they stepped back into their roles. The will reading was a week later. I waited in that lawyer's office thinking about how our lives would be rearranged and how grief would settle into us like dust. I expected sorrow and decisions, not betrayal. The lawyer read the document with practiced detachment. Everything, the company, the properties, the investments, was left to Marcus and Elena. My mother received a life estate in the house and a small discretionary fund. I was handed a box of memories. Faded photos, my father's old watch, a single folded letter with his handwriting across the top. The letter wasn't long. It didn't need to be. "Serena," it said, "if you are reading this, it means I failed to keep everything from fracturing. Trust no one." Those 4 words sat in my chest like a burr. I looked at my mother, then at Marcus, then at Elena. My mother's face was a picture of composed sorrow. Too composed. And Marcus gave a polite nod as if he'd always expected to be the heir. Elena's smile was small and calm, the kind of smile you wear when you know the scene is plotted to your advantage. No one said anything else. The lawyer closed the folder, and the room smelled like old paper and the end of a story I thought I had a line in. For weeks I carried that letter like a secret. I went through motion, funeral, condolences, small visits, but inside something was feral. My father had known something. He had left me a warning. If he'd left it for me, then perhaps he'd intended me to do something when he could not. I kept thinking about all the little inconsistencies I'd noticed over the years. Muted conversations in the kitchen, hushed phone calls, the way Marcus sometimes kept receipts in his jacket that he refused to explain. I had smiled and told myself loyalty to family mattered more than curiosity. The note flipped a switch. One night, when the house finally softened under the low hum of night, I went into my father's study. I had been small in the house for too long to be barred from rooms anymore. The study smelled of cedar, dust, and the faint lemon of his aftershave. I opened drawers I had never opened, lifted folders, slid aside a faded calendar. Behind a false bottom in his desk, I found a small stack of documents. At first glance they looked like normal files. Invoices, contracts, endorsements. But the names, the amounts, the offhand codes made my pulse quicken. Payments labeled consulting, channeled to shell companies I'd never heard of. A line in a ledger read like a map. Transfers to entities registered under Marcus's friend's name. Extra payments to a contractor that had no work assigned. Property transactions that had been disguised as routine. Under it all, tucked like a secret bookmark, was another letter addressed to me. My hands shook as I unfolded it. "Serena," my father's handwriting said. "I trusted the wrong people because I wanted peace more than truth. Marcus promised to save us from risk. Elena promised to make things thrive. If you find this, understand that love can be a blindfold when it is convenient. Trust no one." The betrayal didn't explode all at once. It slithered in. I felt sick, not with the loss of my father alone but with the realization that my cousins, my family, had been planning something for years. And my mother, who had always seemed to be the soft center of our world, had known or had chosen to know less than she should have. The box of memory items suddenly felt like ash. I did not confront them that night. Anger can be blinding, and I needed sight. Revenge, if you can call it that, had to be measured, or it would only create more ruin than the crime warranted. So I made a plan that was patient and exact. I would collect evidence. I would build a network. I would pick a moment where truth would be undeniable, and then I would let the house of cards fall. Marcus had a temper and a love of speed. Bets on football and risky investments were his secret relief. Elena had a cultivated image and depended on it. The polished photo shoots, the carefully curated Instagram, the cultivated charm. Their strengths were the soft underbelly I would exploit. Marcus's reckless financial habits left tracks. Elena's vanity left digital traces and people who'd been quietly wronged. All I had to do was see the patterns my father had seen, follow the trail he'd left, and be merciless in my patience. I started with the books. Because I'd spent my childhood in the house, I knew where things lived. I had the password to a drawer I'd been given back in the days my father trained me to fetch ledgers. Small privileges that had seemed childish then became keys. I copied files, made backups, and secured everything on 2 separate drives hidden in places Marcus would never look. I took photos of invoices, logged transaction numbers, and kept a ledger of my own. I reached out delicately to a former office manager, a woman named Marta who had been pushed out the same year Marcus began taking bigger roles. Marta met me in a diner, her hands rough from years of unpaid overtime, and when I slid a photograph across to her, she exhaled like a person remembering a loss. She had kept a notebook of odd transactions, names that didn't match projects, and dates when funds had been inexplicably diverted. She handed me her notes and then, with a look that sealed us like conspirators, agreed to speak if the moment came. Next I needed someone who knew the law of public exposure. I contacted a journalist I'd read, a woman named Priya known for quiet, effective investigations. I didn't hand her everything right away. I brought her just enough to pique her curiosity and asked, simply, if she would listen when I was ready. She agreed to meet twice, always with a notepad and an even temper, and she asked the exact question that sat heavy in my chest. Are you prepared for the fallout? I nodded because I had to be. Prepared or not, truth has consequences. Timing mattered. The annual shareholders meeting would be the best stage. Investors, press, and the board all gathered in one room where reverence for legacy would be on display. The meeting was 6 weeks out. I had 6 weeks to build a case, find corroborating witnesses, and plan the reveal so it could not be dismissed as bitterness or rumor. Over those weeks, I worked in the quiet hours, hidden behind spreadsheets and whispers. I mailed copies of certain invoices to an anonymous tip line. I arranged for Marta to release her notes if regulators called. I fed Priya small, corroborated facts to keep her attention. In private, I confronted my mother once. I sat at the kitchen table while the rain came in thin sheets, and I asked a single question. Why did you let them take everything? She didn't answer at first. She looked at me like someone looking at a long-forgotten photograph. Then she said, finally, your father feared fighting a war that would leave everyone worse off. He thought surrender on paper could keep people safe. Her voice cracked on the last word. He wanted peace, even if it was a brittle peace. A word like a veneer. I left without another word. Her answer did not absolve her. It explained a kind of cowardice that had consequences. The day of the shareholders' meeting arrived like a breath held too long. The hall was polished wood and warm light, voices polite, hands clasping programs. Marcus wore a navy suit and a practiced smile. Elena glided in like a photograph come to life. Investors nodded and pretended to joke. I sat in the 4th row, my hands folded, listening to Marcus deliver a smooth speech about stewardship and legacy. I felt the anger like a cold stone in my chest, and then when the Q&A began I stood. Excuse me, I said, and the chairman looked at me with a blend of irritation and obligation. Ms. Del Vecchio, do you have a question? He asked. I walked to the stage and took the microphone. My voice trembled once and then steadied. I presented the documents one by one. Transfer numbers, invoices, timestamps. I laid out the shell companies and the contractors that had been paid with money that should have gone to wages. I read the lines of emails where my cousins instructed the finance office to adjust entries. Cameras leaned in. Phones came out. Priya, who sat in the back, gave me a nod like a soldier acknowledging a plan executed. The room changed. Where once there had been polite applause, there was a thin, stunned silence. Marcus's face drained of color. Elena's posture shifted from composed to brittle. Investors whispered. Someone in the front row demanded to see the documents I'd passed out. The chairman tried to regain control, but the regulators had already been called. By the time I stepped down, the murmurs had formed into a roar of questioning. When the dust settled and headlines rolled out that evening, my cousin's house of cards was exposed. Marcus was put on immediate leave pending investigation. Elena's contracts were suspended, and several board members walked out with papers and grim faces. The firm's stock wavered. Clients asked for audits. My mother sat on the back step of our porch with her hands folded, and for the first time she looked older than she had any right to be. The aftermath was more complicated than the victory I'd imagined in the long nights of planning. Employees panicked. People who had nothing to do with the betrayal lost hours or saw projects paused. The press framed me as both hero and villain in different outlets, and Marcus's supporters called me a traitor. For days, I oscillated between fierce satisfaction and a hollow ache. Revenge had its price, not just for the guilty but for the innocent. The final twist came when my youngest cousin, Lena, found a shoebox of unsent letters my father had written late at night and never mailed. She handed them to me with a shake in her hands. In his careful script were confessions, of fear, of regret, and of a man who had tried to protect the family by choosing quiet negotiation over brutal exposure. He had been complicit in his own silence at times, and at others he had left me breadcrumbs because he had not the courage to speak openly. The letters complicated everything. They were not an excuse. They were human frailty written in ink. Their presence softened the edge of my victory. It reminded me that people are rarely all cruel or all kind. They are contradictions, and the truth often lives in the gray. I used the remainder of my father's savings to create a small emergency fund for the employees hit hardest by the fallout. I reached out to contractors and offered to help mediate late payments. It wasn't enough to erase the damage, but it was something. Months later, Marcus faced charges and Elena's reputation remained in tatters. Some investors sued. Some called for long-term restructuring. My mother withdrew from public life. Lena moved away for a while to get distance. I sat often with my father's letters, reading and rereading them until his handwriting felt like a map of the man I'd loved and the decisions that had failed us all. I am not proud of every moment in this story. Revenge changed me. It sharpened a part of me that was once soft and turned it into something precise and cold when it needed to be. It also taught me that exposing lies is not the same as healing. If you decide to knock down a house of cards, you must be ready to pick up the pieces afterward. So tell me, would you have exposed your own family knowing the fallout might hurt people who had nothing to do with the crime, or would you have carried the secret quietly and let time be the judge? Comment below where you're watching from. If you're new, hit subscribe, there are more stories coming.